The year was 1961. The location? Cuba. The plan? To invade the country, plant the seeds for an insurgence and overthrow Fidel Castro and his communist government. The result? An utter and complete disaster. A disaster that changed the course of history in Cuba and Central America and ultimately almost led to the end of the world. Yes, today we're going to talk about the United States' infamous Bay of Pigs invasion. Hi, my name is Sebastian and you're watching Mistakes That Changed the World. The initial idea of this whole ordeal was to send a small group of rebels to land near some mountains in Cuba. Those rebels were supposed to be the seeds of a large-scale insurgency that would have fought to overthrow Fidel Castro and remove communism from the borders of the United States. The plan was basically modeled after a highly successful CIA program, the PB Success, that had led to the overthrow of a left-wing government in Guatemala in 1954. We won't go into details with that event, although it's an interesting topic to be sure. But due to the successes obtained in Guatemala, in large part it was the same people that were involved in this Cuban affair too. Both plans actually were thought out by Richard Bissell, the head of covert operations at the CIA. Bissell has proven his capabilities and intelligence since taking on the project during the Eisenhower administration. As such, everyone was confident that Castro's fate was sealed and his days were numbered. The CIA really disliked Castro, and this planned invasion wasn't the only plot against him. It ran parallel to other less brilliant maneuvers, including the involvement of mobsters to assassinate Cuba's charismatic leader. The invasion plot, though, had a very strong support from then Vice President and likely future President Richard Nixon. Well, likely or not, it wasn't Nixon that won the next elections, it was John Fitzgerald Kennedy. JFK's ascension to the presidency had two immediate effects. First, Bissell had to sell the program to the new White House president. Kennedy was young, surrounded by hawks from both the Republican and Democrat parties, and had a lot to prove. So in truth, he was inclined to support any project that would portray him as a fighter against communism. Without too many explanations and half-truths, Bissell managed to convince the new president to agree with his plan. The second effect of Nixon's defeat was that Bissell was no longer truly supervised. Nixon had been actively involved in the planning. Kennedy was, however, too busy. As a result, many things changed. The initial small group became a small army. The clandestine landing turned into an amphibious attack, and over 2,000 dissatisfied Cubans began training in secret bases in Central America. Even with these changes, Kennedy continued to support the project, but under the condition that the entire plan be kept secret and that the United States could deny any involvement. The US government was not supposed to appear involved in any way. It wasn't clear, though, whom the Americans expected to blame for an amphibious landing and the B-26 bomber raids on their neighboring island. Anyway, in the summer of 1960, the Miami Herald learned about the training camps and the secret was almost set loose. They were, however, pressured to drop the subject, and unsurprisingly, they did. It didn't last, though, because at the end of October 1960, a newspaper in Guatemala published a detailed report about the Cubans being trained in their country. And then, on January 10, 1961, the issue of the Guatemalan training camps appeared on the front page of the New York Times. The proverbial cat was now out of the bag, and yet the CIA and Bissell remained confident and went forth with their plan. February came, and Bissell's plan now included US Marines, 2 Air Force bombers, several Navy destroyers, plus the Cuban fighters. So on paper at least, this plan should have been a resounding success. Strangely enough, even though they were confident in their success, the Americans had no clear plan regarding what would happen after Castro's overthrow. There was no Cuban government in exile or any other friendly group ready to inspire the masses and take over the government. Anyway, seeing Bissell's adjusted plan, Kennedy now opposed him. A massive invasion of this scale with US troops was out of the question. Despite the CIA's efforts, the president insisted that the invasion should be made exclusively with Cuban personnel without any direct involvement of the US military. Undeterred, Richard Bissell presented a new plan on March 11th, addressing the president's concerns. This new plan involved several thousand people to land, rally the Cuban population, and defeat the Cuban army of 200,000 soldiers. The landing site was now moved to a more suitable beach, but one that was nearly 100 kilometers away from the mountains. Mountains that could have offered safety in case something went wrong. Confidently, Bissell assured Kennedy that the plan would be 100% Cuban and almost guaranteed to succeed. Kennedy approved it and then got distracted by other issues, one of them being Marilyn Monroe. With less than a month remaining until the start of the operation, there was still one issue that needed an answer. Without the involvement of the US Air Force, which Kennedy had withdrawn from the campaign, the invasion still needed support and air cover. The Cuban Air Forces were a bad joke by the standards of the time, but they had enough firepower to hinder the landing, so they had to be dealt with. So the CIA quickly organized a group of B-26 bombers manned by some hastily trained Cuban volunteers. Again, there was no plan regarding any explanations about how some Cuban rebels managed to acquire 3 complete squadrons of heavy US bombers. In the meantime, the Pentagon got involved and examined the final plan. Military officials were not at all impressed, giving the landing only a 30% chance of success. However, not wanting to antagonize the new administration or the CIA, the Joint Chiefs of Staff officially reported to the White House that the plan had sufficient chances of success. Then the PR element of the CIA came into play, and press statements started to emerge from a fake Cuban Revolutionary Council. Come April, the plan moved forward. 1,500 Cubans trained in Guatemala were sent to Nicaragua and put on some rusty cargo ships, which later were referred to as the Cuban Navy in the press statements of the Cuban Revolutionary Council. At this point, anyone with minimal intelligence could deduce that a US involvement was undeniable. In Miami, a so-called defector who had allegedly fled with a presumed B-26 of the Cuban Air Force was exposed. However, the pilot was not a Cuban aviator. Several journalists quickly noticed that, judging by the things he didn't know, he couldn't possibly be part of the Cuban military aviation, and the model of the B-26 he had stolen was of course not one used in Cuba. Castro certainly knew that something was going on and that he was the target. Understanding this, Kennedy cancelled the bombardment intended to isolate the beach where the Cubans were supposed to land. Everyone got the message and knew that the bombers would not come, except for the Cuban rebels at sea. Their morale had already dropped so much that the CIA agent in charge of the landing accompanied the divers to secure the beach. Once on shore, he didn't find any Cuban defenders, only a tavern full of locals partying. The CIA agent then radioed the Cubans to start the landing. Before they reached the shore, a single Cuban army jeep on patrol appeared and swept the beach with its spotlight. It was probably standard procedure and nothing unusual was seen at the moment. But the CIA agent decided to open fire anyway. The jeep disappeared, and with it, the element of surprise. When the boats full of rebels reached the Cuban shores, it was noticed that no one had been assigned command of the operation. Once again, CIA agents took the place of officers and managed this whole mess. Meanwhile, the jeep's crew reported the invasion, and Castro was promptly informed. He immediately ordered the closest military units to repel the invaders. And it so happened that those units belonged to the Cuban Military Academy. The cadets were armed and sent to the landing site. A training plane, a World War II-era Sea Fury with the best pilot of the Cuban Air Force, Enrique Carreras at the controls, also got involved in the fight, bombarding the beach. Pinned down by the cadets and the lone Sea Fury, the 1,500 Cuban rebels and the CIA agent were buried in the sand. More Cuban troops arrived, and it soon became very difficult to bring ammunition from the ships to the beach. By noon, the rebels' ammunition was already running out. It wouldn't be enough for them to leave the beach. It was barely enough to defend themselves. Back in the US, in the evening, Bissell pulled President Kennedy away from an official reception and explained that the situation was kinda desperate. The only way to save the invasion was to launch the fighter jets and bombers from the USS Essex, an aircraft carrier close to the area. At that moment, after approving every action that had been carried out so far, Kennedy lost his composure. He refused to give permission because he still didn't want the United States to be involved. It is said that the Chief of Naval Operations, who was present at the reception, pointed out that the Americans were already involved, but Kennedy refused to give the order. He only suggested that the rebels should flee to the mountains according to the plan, but Bissell clarified that the landing site had been changed, and those mountains were now 100 kilometers away, and anyway, between the rebels and the mountains, there was now an increasingly larger Cuban army. The fighting intensified on the 18th after even more Cuban units arrived. Still, the rebels managed to hold the beach. They had nowhere else to escape anyway. Eventually, Kennedy agreed to a single raid by the Cuban volunteer B-26 bombers. The American fighter planes could accompany the bombers to deter any attack on them, but couldn't attack any ground targets. Unfortunately, the Cuban pilots scheduled to fly the bombers refused. They had seen how their comrades had been abandoned and no longer believed that the American fighters would defend them. Eventually, after some delay, the raid took place. The bombers were piloted by members of the Alabama Air National Guard wearing National Guard uniforms and communicating on American frequencies. But it turned out that the Cuban pilots were right. Someone had forgotten that the backup bombers in Nicaragua and the fighter planes in Florida were in different time zones. 4 National Guard bombers were shot down simply because the fighters never showed up. By the 19th of April, it was painfully obvious that the landing was a complete failure and the rebels couldn't hold out much longer. The CIA operatives had returned to their Cuban Navy ships that were still waiting offshore filled with weapons and ammunition. There was an attempt to reach the beach with that much-needed ammo, but the convoy turned back when the leader of the 1,500 Cuban rebels surrendered before the first ship could reach the shore. The Cuban military detained 1,200 invaders and found 118 dead. 1 year later, President Kennedy secured the release of the survivors from Castro in exchange for the sum of $53 million in food and medicine. Now, most likely, the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion was inevitable given the many changes in the plan. So perhaps the biggest mistake among many others was simply that President Kennedy approved the invasion from the beginning, or that Bissell proposed it. Kennedy's decision was a political one, without paying much attention to military arguments. But when he refused to support the landing with any American forces, Kennedy eliminated any chance of success or even survival for those Cubans who were risking their lives and freedom at the request of the CIA. If the operation would have been managed differently, there would have been a good chance that, given a viable alternative, the Cuban people could have overthrown Castro's increasingly repressive government. The passivity of Russia throughout the entire drama demonstrated those guys' refusal to get involved. But the plan failed spectacularly, and Cuba remains, to this day, one of the last communist regimes in the world. Another consequence of this failure was the imminent threat of nuclear war. Encouraged by Kennedy's hesitant reactions, the Soviets felt free to install nuclear missiles in Cuba. Having learned the lesson of fear, this time Kennedy took a very firm stance against the Russian missiles on Cuban soil, and most experts agree that the two superpowers were just inches away from complete nuclear annihilation. If the plan had worked as it did in Guatemala, the Western Hemisphere might have looked very different, because a capitalist Cuba could have discouraged many communist revolutions in Central and South America. So one has to wonder what the Americas would have looked like today if the Bay of Pigs invasion would have succeeded. I hope this video was interesting enough to have inspired you to look into it further on your own. If you liked it, leave a like and subscribe. You can leave your comments downstairs, and you can also check out my Patreon page if you want to support me. I do hope to see you next time. Bye.